In 1896, a single night destroyed a prince forever. Prince Ludwig Viktor of Austria, brother to an emperor, heir to one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, was caught in a scandal so explosive, so forbidden, that it shattered the Habsburg monarchy's carefully constructed facade. What happened in that Vienna bathhouse didn't just end a royal career. It exposed a secret that the imperial family had been desperately hiding for decades. The newspapers called it the most shameful incident in Habsburg history. The police report, hastily buried by imperial decree, described a scene so scandalous that even today, historians whisper about it in hushed tones. Prince Ludwig Viktor, youngest brother of Emperor Franz Joseph, was discovered in circumstances that would make even the most liberal minds of 1896 recoil in shock. He was found in women's clothing, in the company of other men, in a public bathhouse that had become Vienna's most notorious meeting place for forbidden desires. Tonight, you're about to discover the forbidden diary entries, the secret love letters, and the devastating truth about a prince who chose love over a crown, authenticity over acceptance, and paid the ultimate price. This isn't just another royal scandal. This is the story of a man who lived his truth in an era when that truth could destroy everything he was born to inherit. But here's what they never told you. Ludwig Viktor wasn't just gay in a time when homosexuality could mean death. He was flamboyantly, unapologetically, dangerously authentic in a world that demanded perfect royal performance. While his brothers wore military uniforms and conquered territories, Ludwig Viktor wore makeup, collected art, and fell desperately in love with men who could never love him back without risking their lives. The imperial court had been receiving reports for years. Servants whispered about the prince's unnatural friendships. Diplomats reported his scandalous behavior at state functions. Foreign ambassadors wrote home about the Austrian prince, who seemed more interested in their handsome young attachés than in their daughters. But Emperor Franz Joseph refused to believe it, until that devastating night when denial became impossible. The Habsburg court tried to erase Ludwig Viktor from history. They burned his letters, destroyed his photographs, and banished him from the empire he should have helped rule. They forced him into exile, stripped him of his titles, and made sure his name would be whispered only in shame. But they couldn't erase the courage of a prince who refused to live a lie, even when that lie would have given him everything a man could want. His story begins not with scandal, but with suffocation. Born into a family that ruled half of Europe, Ludwig Viktor was trapped from birth in a golden cage that grew smaller with each passing year. Every breath was monitored, every word calculated, every emotion suppressed for the good of the empire. If you're ready to uncover the most forbidden love story in royal history, a story they never wanted you to hear, then subscribe now, because what you're about to learn will change everything you thought you knew about the Austrian Empire, about royal duty, and about the devastating price of living authentically in a world that demanded conformity above all else. But first, let me take you inside the suffocating walls of Schönbrunn Palace, where a sensitive young prince began to realize that everything expected of him would destroy his soul. Ludwig Viktor's childhood was a masterpiece of suffocation disguised as privilege. Born in 1842 into the most powerful dynasty in Europe, he entered a world where every breath was choreographed, every smile calculated, and every emotion carefully buried beneath layers of imperial protocol. The Habsburg court wasn't just a palace. It was a machine designed to transform human beings into perfect royal specimens, regardless of the cost to their souls. From the moment he could walk, Ludwig Viktor was surrounded by tutors who taught him 17 languages, protocol masters who drilled him in the art of royal bearing, and military instructors who tried to forge him into a warrior prince. But there was something different about this youngest Habsburg son, something that made his instructors exchange worried glances and his mother, Archduchess Sophie, lie awake at night, consumed by a growing dread. While his older brothers, Franz Joseph and Ferdinand Maximilian, displayed the aggressive masculinity expected of Habsburg princes, hunting with ruthless precision, commanding troops with iron discipline, and pursuing women with calculated royal charm, Ludwig Victor preferred the company of artists, poets, and sensitive souls who understood beauty in ways his family found deeply disturbing. The court physicians were consulted in secret. Was there something wrong with the young prince? Why did he show more interest in arranging flowers than arranging military formations? Why did his eyes light up when discussing opera rather than battle strategies? Why did he seem more comfortable in the company of the palace's female servants than with the young military cadets brought to befriend him? Archduchess Sophie, the iron-willed woman who had shaped Emperor Franz Joseph into the perfect ruler, watched her youngest son with a mixture of love and horror. She recognized the signs that every royal mother dreaded. Ludwig Victor was becoming everything the Habsburg dynasty couldn't afford: sensitive, artistic, and dangerously authentic in a world that demanded royal performance above personal truth. The palace became a battlefield for Ludwig Victor's soul. Every day brought new attempts to reshape him into an acceptable Habsburg prince. He was forced into military uniforms that felt like costumes, dragged to hunting expeditions where the violence made him physically ill, and paraded before suitable young ladies who bored him to tears while their brothers captured his imagination with their passionate discussions of art and philosophy. By age 15, the transformation campaign had become desperate. Ludwig Victor was sent to study with the most masculine tutors in the empire, forced to spend months with military regiments, and constantly supervised to ensure he displayed appropriate princely behavior. But every attempt to crush his true nature only made it more apparent to those who dared to look closely. The tragedy wasn't just that Ludwig Victor was different. It was that his difference was exactly what the Habsburg court feared most. In an empire held together by rigid tradition and unwavering authority, a prince who questioned everything, who felt deeply, who refused to perform the expected role, represented an existential threat to the very foundations of imperial power. But behind the palace walls, away from the watching eyes of courtiers and diplomats, Ludwig Victor was discovering something that would change his life forever. He wasn't alone. Vienna's underground world was calling to him, promising acceptance, understanding, and perhaps even love. At 19, Prince Ludwig Victor made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was not the only one living a lie in the glittering world of Vienna's high society. Beneath the marble facades of the imperial capital, behind the velvet curtains of aristocratic salons, a secret world thrived. A dangerous underground where men like him found each other in the shadows, risking everything for moments of authentic connection. It began with stolen glances across crowded ballrooms. While other young nobles flirted openly with marriageable daughters of the empire, Ludwig Victor found himself captivated by their brothers, their military escorts, their artistic companions. The realization hit him like a physical blow during a state dinner in 1861. He was watching Count Alexander's mouth as he spoke about poetry, imagining what it would feel like to kiss those lips, when he suddenly understood the terrible truth about himself. The internal war that followed was devastating. Everything Ludwig Victor had been taught about duty, honor, and royal responsibility crashed against this undeniable truth about his desires. He spent sleepless nights in his ornate bedroom, staring at religious paintings that seemed to judge him, praying to a god who apparently had created him wrong, begging for deliverance from feelings that felt as natural as breathing, but as forbidden as treason. His first taste of the underground came through Baron Ernst von Fleischl, a charming intellectual who moved easily between Vienna's official society and its hidden world. Ernst recognized something in the young prince's desperate eyes and gradually introduced him to a network of aristocrats, artists, and intellectuals who shared their dangerous secret. These gatherings happened in private apartments, in secluded sections of public gardens, in opera boxes where whispered conversations carried more meaning than the performances on stage. Ludwig Victor discovered places where men could be themselves without fear, at least temporarily. The Prater Gardens at midnight, certain coffee houses where knowing glances were exchanged, private salons where artists and writers gathered to discuss forbidden topics. It was intoxicating and terrifying. For the first time in his life, he felt understood, accepted, desired for who he truly was, rather than what his title represented. But every moment of authentic connection came with crushing guilt. He was betraying everything his family stood for, everything the Habsburg dynasty represented. The empire's laws were clear. What he was feeling, what he was beginning to do, could result in imprisonment, exile, or worse. More terrifying still, he was betraying his brother, the emperor, who had always protected him, who trusted him to uphold the family honor. His first love affair was with a young officer named Captain Karl Schlesinger, a devastatingly handsome cavalry officer who shared Ludwig Victor's passion for art and literature. Their meetings were arranged in secret, their correspondence conducted through intermediaries, their stolen moments together, both ecstatic and agonizing. Karl understood the stakes as clearly as Ludwig Victor did. Discovery would mean the end of everything for both of them. The psychological toll was immense. Ludwig Victor began experiencing what palace physicians termed nervous episodes, periods of deep melancholy followed by manic energy, sudden outbursts of emotion that scandalized the court, and increasingly desperate attempts to numb his internal conflict with alcohol and dangerous behavior. The pressure of living a double life was literally driving him toward madness. By 1863, rumors were beginning to circulate. Servants whispered about the prince's strange friendships. Courtiers noticed his lack of interest in suitable marriage prospects. Foreign diplomats reported unusual behavior that raised questions about the youngest Habsburg's fitness for royal duties. But Ludwig Victor had tasted authentic love, and despite the devastating consequences he could see approaching like a storm on the horizon, he found himself unable to return to the suffocating performance of royal duty. The awakening had begun, and there was no going back. By 1864, the Habsburg court had reached a terrifying conclusion. Prince Ludwig Victor needed a wife, and he needed one immediately. The whispers had grown too loud, the rumors too persistent, and Emperor Franz Joseph could no longer ignore the reports reaching his desk about his brother's unnatural associations. What followed was one of the most psychologically brutal campaigns in royal history, the systematic destruction of a man's soul in the name of imperial duty. Archduchess Sophie personally orchestrated the marriage negotiations with the ruthless efficiency of a military campaign. Every eligible princess in Europe was considered, evaluated, and ranked according to her potential to transform Ludwig Victor into an acceptable Habsburg heir. The chosen victim was Princess Matilda of Bavaria, a sweet, innocent 17-year-old who had no idea she was being sacrificed to save the reputation of a dynasty. The betrothal announcement in 1865 nearly broke Ludwig Victor completely. Standing in the mirror hall of Schönbrunn Palace, surrounded by celebrating courtiers and diplomats, he felt like he was attending his own funeral. Princess Mathilde smiled beside him, radiant with joy at her royal match, while Ludwig Victor fought waves of nausea as he contemplated the life sentence he was about to accept. But here's what the court never understood. You cannot cure authentic love with forced performance. Every public appearance with his bride-to-be became an exercise in psychological torture. Ludwig Victor had to hold her hand while dreaming of Captain Schlesinger's touch, had to smile lovingly into her eyes while his heart belonged to another, had to discuss their future children while knowing that the very idea of intimacy with her made his skin crawl. Behind the facade of royal courtship, Ludwig Victor's secret life intensified with desperate urgency. If marriage would end his freedom forever, he was determined to experience everything he could before the prison doors closed permanently. His affairs became more frequent, more reckless, more public. He began appearing at underground gatherings without disguise, visiting known meeting places for men like him, and conducting relationships with a boldness that terrified even his closest confidants. The psychological pressure manifested in increasingly erratic behavior that scandalized Vienna's high society. Ludwig Victor appeared at state functions wearing makeup, spoke in affected mannerisms that made foreign dignitaries uncomfortable, and displayed emotional volatility that led to whispered diagnoses of hysteria and nervous disorders. The court physicians prescribed treatments ranging from cold baths to religious counseling, but nothing could address the fundamental impossibility of his situation. Princess Matilda began to sense something was wrong. Their private conversations felt stilted, their physical contact minimal and awkward. She confided to her mother that her fiancé seemed more interested in discussing her brother's military service than planning their wedding. The poor girl blamed herself, convinced she wasn't beautiful or charming enough to capture her prince's heart. Meanwhile, Captain Schlesinger was transferred to a remote posting in Hungary. A clear message from the Imperial Command that Ludwig Viktor's romantic attachments had been noticed and would not be tolerated. The forced separation pushed Ludwig Viktor toward a complete psychological breakdown. Court observers noted his increasing reliance on alcohol, his sudden outbursts of rage, followed by periods of catatonic depression, and his growing defiance of royal protocol. The wedding date was set for spring 1866, but as the months passed, it became increasingly obvious that Ludwig Viktor was incapable of going through with the charade. The question was no longer whether he would conform to royal expectations, but how spectacularly he would destroy himself, trying to escape them. Tell me in the comments, what part of this story shocks you the most so far? The family's ruthless manipulation, Ludwig Viktor's desperate rebellion, or the innocent princess caught in the middle of this royal nightmare? What happened next would transform a private struggle into a very public scandal that shocked all of Europe. And the spring of 1866 brought a series of incidents so shocking that they permanently altered the course of European royal history. Ludwig Viktor, driven to desperation by his approaching wedding and the suffocating pressure of imperial expectations, began a campaign of public defiance so bold that it made denial impossible even for Emperor Franz Joseph. It started at the Grand Opera Ball, Vienna's most prestigious social event. While Princess Matilda waited for their traditional opening dance, Ludwig Viktor disappeared with Baron Friedrich von Tschirschky, a handsome Prussian diplomat. They were discovered in a private box, locked in an embrace so passionate that the Austrian minister who found them required medical attention for shock. The whispers spread through Vienna's society like wildfire. 2 weeks later came the bathhouse scandal that would become legendary. Ludwig Viktor, wearing women's clothing and jewelry, was caught in Vienna's central baths during what police reports called inappropriate activities with several men. The arresting officers were so stunned to discover a Habsburg prince in such circumstances that they initially refused to believe his identity. At a state dinner honoring the King of Prussia, he appeared wearing rouge and powder, spoke in deliberately effeminate mannerisms, and openly flirted with young military attachés. When Princess Matilda attempted to redirect his attention, he dismissed her so rudely that foreign diplomats filed formal complaints about his behavior. The European press began picking up these stories. The London Times published articles about unusual incidents involving the Austrian imperial family. French newspapers ran satirical cartoons depicting effeminate Austrian princes. Emperor Franz Joseph watched his family's reputation crumble under his brother's rebellion. Princess Matilda's family demanded answers. Her father threatened to withdraw from the engagement unless Ludwig Viktor's reformation could be guaranteed. This wasn't just family crisis. It was diplomatic disaster threatening alliances across Europe. The most devastating blow came when Count Rudolf Colloredo publicly refused to attend functions where Ludwig Viktor would be present, declaring he could not expose his family to such corrupting influence. When a Habsburg prince became persona non grata among his own aristocracy, the situation had moved beyond scandal. Behind palace walls, the response was swift. Ludwig Viktor was confined under guard, his correspondence monitored, contact restricted. Archduchess Sophie reportedly suffered nervous collapse when she grasped the extent of her son's public defiance. Tell me in the comments, what part of this story shocks you the most so far? The family's ruthless manipulation, Ludwig Viktor's desperate rebellion, or the innocent princess caught in this royal nightmare? But the breaking point was coming. Ludwig Viktor's most passionate love affair was about to begin, a relationship so dangerous that it would force his family to make a decision that would change everything. Emperor Franz Joseph had built an empire on the principle that Habsburg authority was absolute and unquestionable. But his brother's scandals were proving that even imperial power had limits when confronted with a man who refused to live a lie. What followed was one of the most systematic and ruthless cover-up campaigns in royal history, a desperate attempt to save the dynasty by destroying the man who threatened it. The first strategy was medical intervention. Court physicians diagnosed Ludwig Victor with nervous hysteria and moral insanity, convenient medical terms that allowed the family to frame his homosexuality as a curable mental illness. The treatments were brutal: ice baths designed to shock the system back to normalcy, religious counseling sessions lasting hours, and experimental medications that left Ludwig Victor semi-conscious. When medical treatments failed, the family turned to geographical solutions. Ludwig Victor was sent to remote castles across the empire under the pretext of recuperation. He spent months at the isolated fortress of Klesheim near Salzburg, where armed guards ensured no contact with the outside world except through carefully monitored correspondence. But isolation only intensified Ludwig Victor's desperation. During confinement at Klesheim, he attempted suicide twice, once by poison and once by throwing himself from a castle tower. Both attempts were hushed up completely, with official reports describing them as accidents during temporary mental confusion. The family's terror was palpable. Suicide would mean eternal scandal. Archduchess Sophie took personal control of rehabilitation efforts. She moved into Klesheim Castle, bringing priests, physicians, and military officers tasked with rebuilding Ludwig Victor's character from scratch. The psychological warfare was relentless. Constant surveillance, forced prayers, military drills designed to instill masculine behavior, and daily lectures about royal duty. The most cruel aspect was the systematic destruction of Ludwig Victor's identity. His belongings were searched and confiscated, letters from lovers burned, artistic materials removed, books deemed inappropriate destroyed. The family was literally trying to erase the parts of him that made him human, leaving only the royal shell they needed. Meanwhile, Emperor Franz Joseph worked frantically to manage political damage. Foreign ambassadors were quietly assured that rumors were greatly exaggerated and the prince was receiving treatment for a temporary nervous condition. Marriage negotiations with Princess Matilda were suspended but not cancelled, maintaining the fiction that engagement would proceed. The international press posed the greatest threat. Journalists across Europe were investigating Vienna stories, and several newspapers had obtained detailed accounts of Ludwig Victor's behavior. The Habsburg intelligence network worked overtime to suppress these stories through bribes, legal threats, and diplomatic pressure. Under constant surveillance and psychological pressure, Ludwig Victor began internalizing his family's hatred of his true nature. Palace observers noted periods where he seemed to genuinely believe he was sick, begging for forgiveness and promising to become the son his family wanted. But the cover-up wasn't saving the family reputation. It was creating conditions for an even more spectacular explosion that would destroy everything they were trying to protect. In autumn 1867, while imprisoned at Klesheim Castle under his family's rehabilitation program, Ludwig Victor experienced something that would shatter every chain they had forged around him. He fell desperately in love. The object of his passion was Lieutenant Colonel Ferenc Duque, a devastatingly handsome Hungarian officer assigned to his security detail, a man whose presence would ignite the most dangerous romance in Habsburg history. Duque was everything Ludwig Victor had dreamed of: tall, dark-eyed, intellectually brilliant, and possessed of quiet strength that radiated masculine confidence. Unlike frightened young men from Vienna's underground, Duque was a decorated war hero who feared nothing, not scandal, not society, not even emperor's wrath. When their eyes met across the castle courtyard, both men felt the earth shift beneath their feet. The romance that blossomed was unlike anything Ludwig Victor had experienced. Where previous affairs had been desperate, furtive encounters filled with shame, his relationship with Duque was passionate, tender, and unapologetically authentic. They shared not just physical desire, but intellectual compatibility, emotional intimacy, and profound understanding that transcended their dangerous circumstances. Their love affair unfolded in imperial surveillance shadows, secret meetings in abandoned castle towers, stolen moments in forests during supervised walks, passionate encounters in hidden chambers that once sheltered medieval lovers. Duque devised elaborate schemes to evade guards, create private moments, and communicate through coded messages disguised as routine military reports. The letters they exchanged, later discovered and destroyed by imperial order, were described as among the most passionate love letters in European history. Ludwig Victor poured his soul onto paper, describing not just physical desire, but gratitude for finding someone who loved him for who he truly was, rather than his title. Duque's responses were equally intense, promising protection, even if it cost everything. Their love came with devastating consequences. Ludwig Victor's psychological condition, deteriorating under brutal family treatment, began stabilizing dramatically once Duque entered his life. Palace physicians noted improved appetite, better sleep, renewed interest in activities. The irony was crushing. The relationship his family would consider most destructive was healing damage their cure had inflicted. Duque found himself torn between military oath of loyalty to Habsburg dynasty and growing love for a man whose existence threatened that dynasty's foundations. As a career officer, he understood political implications better than Ludwig Victor. Discovery wouldn't just mean disgrace, it would mean treason charges, court-martial, likely execution for both. By winter 1867, the lovers began making desperate escape plans. Duque had connections in Hungary, remote estates where they might live quietly beyond imperial reach. Ludwig Victor was prepared to renounce titles, inheritance, everything connecting him to Habsburg name, for authentic love and freedom. They planned escape for spring 1868, unaware that imperial intelligence had begun suspecting the true nature of their relationship. The trap was closing around them, but neither could see it. They were too intoxicated by love to realize their every move was watched, every letter intercepted, every plan reported to people who would stop at nothing to destroy them both. March 15th, 1868, the date that forever marked the end of Prince Ludwig Victor's life as he knew it. Imperial intelligence had been watching, gathering evidence of his affair with Lieutenant Colonel Duque for months. When they struck, it was with calculated precision designed not just to separate the lovers, but to destroy Ludwig Victor completely. The trap was sprung during what Ludwig Victor believed would be a routine morning walk in castle gardens. As he approached their secret meeting place, he found not his lover, but a tribunal of imperial officials led by General Baron von Molinari. Duque was already there, bound in chains, his face bloodied from interrogation, his eyes filled with desperate love and terrible regret. What followed was the most humiliating scene in Ludwig Victor's life. General Molinari read aloud from their intercepted love letters, every passionate word, every intimate confession now twisted into evidence of moral corruption and treasonous behavior. The most private moments of their souls were laid bare before sneering officials who savored every word of degradation. Duque was first to break. Under threat of execution for treason, he publicly renounced his relationship with Ludwig Victor, claiming he had been seduced and corrupted by the prince's unnatural desires. Each denial hit Ludwig Victor like physical blows. The man who had promised eternal love was now painting himself as innocent victim of royal perversion. But the worst was yet to come. Emperor Franz Joseph himself arrived at Klesheim Castle that afternoon, his face a mask of imperial fury and personal devastation. For the first time, Ludwig Victor saw not brotherly concern but cold, implacable hatred in the emperor's eyes. "You are no longer my brother," Franz Joseph declared, his voice carrying absolute imperial authority. "You are a disease that threatens everything our family has built for centuries. You will renounce all Habsburg titles, accept permanent exile from Austrian territories, and live knowing you have brought shame upon a dynasty that once loved you." The formal announcement was crafted with cruel precision. Vienna's newspapers reported that Prince Ludwig Victor had suffered complete moral and psychological collapse and would be seeking permanent treatment abroad for his unfortunate mental condition. The coded language fooled no one. Society understood exactly what had happened. Princess Matilda's family withdrew from engagement immediately, publicly expressing relief at avoiding connection to such moral degeneracy. Diplomatic consequences rippled across Europe as foreign courts quietly noted that Habsburg dynasty had produced a prince so depraved his own family couldn't tolerate him. Stripped of titles, income, and imperial protection, Ludwig Viktor faced exile with nothing but small allowance designed to keep him alive but ensure poverty. More crushing was psychological impact. After years of pressure to conform, he had found authentic love, only to watch it destroyed by people who claimed to want his happiness. As the carriage carrying him toward permanent exile rolled through Klesheim gates for the last time, Ludwig Viktor understood his real punishment was just beginning. The family had given him exactly what he claimed to want, freedom from royal expectations, but with a price so high, it would torture him forever. The Villa Wortholz in Bad Ischl became Ludwig Viktor's golden prison for the next 49 years, a beautiful estate that concealed one of the most tragic stories in royal history. Stripped of his titles, cut off from his family, and forbidden from returning to Vienna, the man who had once been fourth in line to the Habsburg throne found himself living in luxurious solitude that felt more suffocating than any dungeon. The early years of exile were a psychological hell that nearly destroyed what remained of Ludwig Viktor's sanity. Cut off from everything that had defined his identity, his family, his country, his social circle, he fell into periods of deep depression that lasted for months. Palace servants reported finding him staring out windows for hours, apparently seeing nothing, or walking the villa's gardens at night, talking to ghosts of lovers who would never return. The isolation was made more cruel by its comfort. Ludwig Viktor lived in material luxury, fine food, beautiful surroundings, servants to attend his every need, but he was spiritually starving. The Habsburg allowance was designed to keep him alive but dependent, comfortable but powerless. He could never leave Austrian territories without imperial permission that would never come, could never see his family again, could never return to the life he had sacrificed for authentic love. The psychological torture of exile was compounded by his complete ignorance of Duquesne's fate. Had his lover been executed, exiled to some remote colonial outpost, forced to marry and live the lie Ludwig Viktor had refused to accept? The not knowing was perhaps the cruelest aspect of his punishment, a wound that could never heal because it could never be properly mourned. As years passed, Ludwig Viktor developed coping mechanisms that would have broken a lesser man's spirit entirely. He threw himself into art collection, acquiring paintings and sculptures that filled the villa with beauty he could no longer find in human connection. He became an obsessive reader, consuming literature from across Europe as a way of traveling to places he would never see again. He wrote journals, letters never sent, poetry that poured out his anguish onto pages no one would ever read. The few visitors allowed to see him reported a man transformed by suffering into something almost ethereal. Ludwig Viktor had grown pale and thin, his once vibrant personality subdued by decades of enforced solitude. He spoke little, moved like a ghost through rooms filled with treasures that meant nothing to him, and seemed to exist in a permanent state of mourning for the life he might have lived. But perhaps the cruelest irony of his exile was that it came at precisely the moment when European attitudes toward men like him were beginning to evolve. The late 19th century saw the emergence of scientific and literary discussions about homosexuality that moved beyond simple moral condemnation. Writers like Oscar Wilde, though ultimately persecuted, had opened public conversations about love between men. Ludwig Viktor was living in isolation just as the world was beginning to understand that he wasn't morally defective. He was simply human. The loneliness was absolute. No romantic relationships were possible under constant surveillance. No friendships could develop when every visitor was vetted by imperial security. No family contact was permitted except through formal channels that reduced his siblings to distant, disapproving strangers. Ludwig Viktor existed in a social vacuum that preserved his body while slowly killing his soul. As the new century dawned, Ludwig Viktor had become a living ghost. A man whose punishment for loving authentically was to spend half a century watching the world change from behind the gilded bars of imperial mercy. He was free to be himself, as his family had sarcastically promised, but that freedom came with the guarantee that he would be utterly, completely, eternally alone. But even in exile, even in defeat, Ludwig Viktor's story was about to acquire a meaning that would outlast the empire that destroyed him. Prince Ludwig Viktor of Austria died on January 18th, 1919, in his villa at Bad Ischl, alone, forgotten by history, but unbroken in spirit. As the Habsburg Empire collapsed around him in the chaos of World War I, the man who had been exiled for loving too authentically witnessed the destruction of the very dynasty that had sacrificed him on the altar of public respectability. The irony was profound. The empire that had seemed eternal enough to justify destroying one man's happiness had crumbled, while the courage he had shown in living his truth would echo through generations. What the Habsburg court never understood was that Ludwig Viktor's rebellion wasn't just personal defiance. It was a preview of a revolution that would transform human understanding of love, identity, and the right to authentic existence. While they saw only scandal and shame, he was actually pioneering a form of courage that wouldn't be widely recognized for another century. His story began resonating in ways the imperial censors could never have imagined. Despite their efforts to erase him from history, whispered accounts of the gay prince spread through Europe's underground networks of men who loved men. In the hidden salons of Paris, the secret societies of London, the artistic circles of Berlin, Ludwig Viktor became a symbol of tragic nobility, a man who had chosen authenticity over comfort and paid the ultimate price. The letters that survived imperial destruction became underground treasures, copied and shared among those who understood their significance. His passionate correspondence with Duque, fragments of his journals, and accounts of his defiant behavior at court became founding documents of what would eventually become the modern LGBTQ+ rights movement. Long before anyone used terms like gay pride, Ludwig Viktor had demonstrated what it meant to live with dignity in the face of universal condemnation. Perhaps most powerfully, his story became a bridge between the isolated suffering of the past and the collective action of the future. Every LGBTQ+ person who has ever chosen authenticity over acceptance, who has risked everything to live their truth, who has faced exile from family and society for the crime of loving honestly, walks in the footsteps Ludwig Viktor carved through his suffering. The villa at Bad Ischl, where he spent nearly 50 years in exile, has become an unofficial pilgrimage site for those who understand what he represented. Visitors leave flowers, write letters to the ghost of a prince who died before his time, and find strength in the story of a man who refused to apologize for his authentic self, even when that refusal cost him everything. Modern historians recognize Ludwig Viktor as one of the earliest public figures to live openly as a gay man in an era when such openness meant social death. His courage predated the Stonewall riots by nearly a century, the gay liberation movement by decades, and marriage equality by more than 150 years. He was a pioneer who paid the price of exploration so that future generations could find safer paths to authenticity. The Habsburg dynasty that destroyed him is now a historical curiosity, remembered mainly for its spectacular collapse and political failures. But Ludwig Viktor's legacy grows stronger with each passing year, each coming out story, each act of LGBTQ+ courage that echoes his original rebellion against a world that demanded conformity over truth. His life asks us the fundamental question that every generation must answer. Is it better to live a lie that society accepts, or to live authentically and face the consequences? Ludwig Viktor's answer cost him his family, his country, his titles, and his happiness, but it gained him immortality as a symbol of the courage it takes to be truly human. If this story has moved you, if Ludwig Viktor's courage has inspired you to think differently about authenticity, love, and the price of truth, then subscribe and share his story. The world needs to remember that the freedom to love authentically was paid for by people like him, Brave souls who sacrificed everything so that future generations could live without shame. Their courage lit a candle in the darkness. Our job is to keep that flame burning.